very pleased that we have two very distinguished people with us, including my dear friend Jeff Adams, of course, and Ron McGregor. And I read with great interest a piece that he wrote very recently. It was a fascinating article, I thought, which deals with how troops ought to be deployed, how we ought to think about the military. And I think that ought to be the basis of this conversation. Let's start a conversation about what our needs really are. I went to the quadrennial meeting on the budget for the Marine Corps. And it was astonishing to me because there was no discussion about mission, only discussion about retrenchment. Now, the retrenchment is probably desirable. This wasn't as if I opposed it, but I kept saying, why 180,000? Why not 150,000? Or why not 200,000? 100,000? There wasn't any justification. It was just a mandate from the White House to cut the budget. And very little thinking, there was no philosophical underpinnings to the decision that was made except to cut. And so I think what we really need as a country is a serious discussion about what our military forces are supposed to do, how should they be organized, what the cuts actually mean, what can we do in a sensible way in order to protect the security of this nation. So that is my preamble. And so, Doug, you wrote this great piece, so why don't we start with you, and then we'll respond.
Well, you know, one thing is I'm sure you work here on the Hill, and you talk to your bosses and your constituents and so forth. One thing to keep in mind is something that Alfred Thayer said to Teddy Roosevelt when he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1899. I'm sure you're familiar with Alfred Thayer. If you're not, Alfred Thayer wrote about sea power and essentially framed the argument for the great fleets that we built in the 20th century. And Teddy Roosevelt had come to him and said, I've got a real problem. And at that point, remember, Alfred Thayer was persona non grata to the Admirals for writing this book. And he said, Captain, there's this man, Lieutenant Sims, and Lieutenant Sims has developed a technology for use on our battleships that compensates for the roll in the ocean, so that when the gun fires, it's accurate, it's a target. The Admirals were furious with that. And the reason the Admirals were angry is they said, if we do this, then engagements will occur at greater ranges, and our officers will be unwilling to bring their ships alongside that of the enemy and fight it out at close range, which was what navies did in the 19th century. And he said, what do I do? What do I do? They want to lynch Lieutenant Sims. And Teddy Roosevelt, or Alfred Thayer, as the captain, said, Mr. Secretary, no service can or should be expected to reform itself. That's your job. And that's, if I say nothing else for the rest of the hour, not that Jed's beard is cast over, but if I say nothing else, remember that. You can't expect the services to do anything other than what they're doing, and that's what you saw. There is no questioning of anything. It's how do we keep doing what we've always done? How do we sustain the status quo? How do we keep the money flowing? Money flowing is very important. You know that from your experience here on the Hill. Members are very concerned about keeping the money going. They're worried about their districts and factories. People in York, Pennsylvania, they have 500-600 people employed building armored fighting vehicles to keep them employed. And the problem is that the generals and the admirals, for the most part, have very little incentive to do something new. They just don't. And, hey, Tony, and since there is no serious external military threat right now, there's even less incentive for them to do anything. Because their argument is, well, everything we're doing is fine, isn't it? And then the second part of this is, at the same time, the downward pressure on defense spending is unrelenting, and it's not going to stop. The American people have said, look, we're not going to support any more interventions. The bottom 90% of the American electorate is very unhappy with the situation right now. We are not recovering. Everybody says we're recovering, but that's not what most people think. My point is very simple. It's not going to stop. So you're going to have less funds in the future than you had in the past. And the question is, what do we do? And the danger is that if we do nothing, and when I say we, I'm talking about you guys, your bosses, the members, people in the House and Senate. If nothing is demanded, then you'll end up with what you've got today, only smaller. And it'll be less capable, with lots of overhead, lots of tail, and in 10 years, when the threat picture changes, and it will, this current threat picture is not permanent, it will change, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And the argument that the generals will make in 8 years is, well, gee, you wouldn't give us any money.
Look, I mean, I understand that argument, but the question then becomes, what would you do under the present set of circumstances, recognizing the fact that the world is dynamic and that the threat picture is obviously going to change 5 years, 10 years.
Mhm.
You're absolutely right about that. So the question is, what do you do now? How do you prepare for a world that is not entirely clear? I mean, we understand that the waters are roiling all over the globe, and military preparation of some kind is necessary. But what is necessary? How should we think about this matter?
Well, we've been through this before, believe it or not. In 1900, the British Empire confronted exactly the same set of circumstances that we confront today. They were spending more on their military than they had ever spent in their entire history, despite the fact that there was no existential military threat to the British Empire. And there was no evidence in any particular direction regarding who would be the future enemy. In 1900, they had just avoided, in 1898, 2 years earlier, open war with France at the Fashota incident in Sudan. Russia was widely viewed as by far the most serious adversary because of its constant incursions through Afghanistan and threats to India, its behavior in the Balkans. Germany, the British people had never fought a war with the Germans. German-speaking and English-speaking peoples had never gone to war. There was no assumption that anything would happen there. In fact, the King of England, that takes over after Victoria, is a German. Victoria was effectively a German. So there was the assumption that, Germany was not necessarily preordained to be his future enemy. And at that point, people sat down and they asked exactly the same question, what do we do? And they said, well, we've got to build forces that we think are going to be survivable and effective regardless of the circumstances. And remember that Britain, like the United States, was primarily a maritime power. And we are primarily a maritime aerospace power. We are not a global land power. We don't need any territory. We have all the territory we have. We don't have to conquer any territory. So if we're going to commit ground forces in large numbers, it's probably going to be in response to an emerging crisis or conflict that involves allies and friends on the Eurasian landmass. Now, why did I say the Eurasian landmass? Because that's the only place that you're likely to see any serious action. Could you have a fight with Venezuela? I'm sure you probably could, be awfully short. I don't see anything happening in Latin America. I know there's an obsession with Africa that we want. I don't see anything happening in Africa. So there's two poles of military power in the world: Europe, North America, Northeast Asia. Everything in between, quite frankly, we can handle without a great deal of difficulty in most cases with most of our aerospace and maritime power. Now, that is not going to be permanent either, because we see technologies proliferating, we see powers emerging. Turkey is a perfect example of that. Much more capable, resourceful population economy than anything you've seen in Iran. Could go nuclear overnight, just like that. Pakistan, dangerous, unstable, but fortunately Pakistan has to worry about being nuked by the Russians long before we get around to it, along with India. So the point is that if you look at the world today, we're not entirely sure exactly where we're going to fight or when, so we have to build forces designed around that. And by the way, the ground force has to be designed to operate within that aerospace maritime framework. And the lesson of history for the United States is that Injan is fine, but going to the Alu is a bad idea. In other words, when you move beyond the limits of your capabilities as a great power, in the United States case as a maritime and aerospace power, and you embroil yourself in a continental war with a continental power, you're in a lot of trouble. We are not Germany. We are not Russia. We are not China. We are not going to maintain large and powerful armies. That means you're going to end up with smaller ground forces, and then what you do with those and how you organize them is very, very important. The naval and the air side is pretty fluid. Now, you don't need full spectrum dominance. I'm sure you've heard that. Full spectrum dominance. We want full spectrum dominance whenever we fight. Yeah, but you don't need full spectrum dominance everywhere all the time. What you need to be able to do is achieve that full spectrum dominance when and where you need it. That's different. And it goes back to Frederick the Great's old adage: he who seeks to defend everywhere wins nowhere. We have been spread very thinly all over the globe. That's going to end, because at the same time that we're going to see these decreases in defense spending, we're going to see a fire sale in the old empire, because we're not going to keep it. And the Japanese know it, and the Koreans know it, and the Chinese know it, and that's fine. But there's a difference between the future and the past. If we're going to be partners with the Japanese, and we're going to have an alliance with the Japanese, they need to understand that whether they or Japan or Taiwan, for instance, controls those two islands that are north of Taiwan is really not our affair. It's not important to us. What's important to us is an attack on the Japanese home islands. That's unacceptable, and that's something to which we will respond. But those little island disputes that you're hearing about are all over the Pacific, and they're not new. They simply were placed on hold after World War II because we were the only ones left standing. That's over now. And you're going to have these disputes all over Asia. They are going to have to be resolved by the powers in those areas. But the notion that we should commit American blood and treasure, put our nation at great risk in a global war, potentially with a great power like China, a continental power, over a couple of islands is a very dangerous thing. And I think the Chinese know that, and by the way, the Japanese do. But here's something else we need to keep in mind. China reached the limits of its expansion years ago. China has been the subject, the target, the object of attack through most of its history. It can't expand any further than it already has. It's got 1.2 billion people, 700, 800 million are very unhappy with poverty, as an example. Japan, on the other hand, is homogenous, has one of the most highly developed scientific industrial bases in the world, and to be perfectly blunt, what nobody wants to tell you is that the Japanese Navy will sink the Chinese Navy like that, in and around those islands. Japanese aircraft will put down the Chinese aircraft very quickly. The Koreans in South Korea are infinitely more capable and more powerful than anything to the north. And as we move back and retreat from this very forward positioning of ourselves around the world, these new regional dynamics are going to take over. If we stay and try to suppress them, they will force their way to the surface anyway. We cannot control the world. We have to live with the world. And we have to accommodate these forces. And when we go into regions, as we have over the last 50 years, what do? We deform the natural forces. What do you see emerging in the Middle East today? Everyone talks about the Sunni-Shia split. That's part of it. But there are only two great powers in the Middle East, historically. One is Turkish, and the other is Persian. Gee, what a surprise. And by the way, they hate each other. Gee, that's too bad. Well, my point is, these are realities. And the Shia, historically, have always aligned themselves with whom? Christian Europe, against the Sunni Turks. So the point is, we're seeing old dynamics reassert themselves. This is not going to stop. This is going to continue. It's a matter of maneuvering through these things and engaging in what I would call partnerships of limited liability. Partnerships that make sense, but are not unambiguous, unconditional, and unending. Because yesterday's partner may be tomorrow's opponent, depending on the circumstances. We have to be flexible. We can be flexible because we are a maritime and aerospace power. We are not trying to hold other people's territory. But if we do have to go in, and it becomes an issue of tipping the balance in favor of one side versus the other, we have to be able to do that with the ground forces appropriately organized. And that's really those are my basic strategic arguments on force design. And they're not popular because as soon as you admit that you don't have to be everywhere all the time and influence everything everywhere all the time, the services are afraid of losing money. And they're right. They are going to lose money, but that's going to happen anyway. So the question is, when the defense budget is cut to $400 billion, what do you do with what's left over? How do you organize it? And there's a lot of bloat in it. You know, for instance, right now in the Marine Corps, there's one officer for every 4 enlisted men. In the Army, there's one officer for every 5 enlisted men. What? This is bizarre. This makes no sense. You know, but look what we're shedding. Look what we're dumping out of these forces. Thousands of Marines. Thousands of soldiers, the people who can actually deploy and fight. You know, it's the same in business. How many people do you have in the assembly line versus how many do you have in the intermediate managerial levels? What are they doing? What do you want to maximize? Production, productivity, and output. You want to maximize sales. You don't necessarily want to maximize management. The Department of Defense is at the end of 50 years of Cold War bloat. And these forces were all designed at the end of the Second World War. They're They're enshrined in the 1947 National Security Act. Then we moved to Goldwater Nichols, which did some positive things in terms of joint us on a strategic level, but then at the very end of the Cold War, we built these giant global command structures at exactly the point in time where we needed to constrain those and reduce them in size. We have too many combatant commands. And when you don't change the force, when you don't change the way you're organized, you don't do business differently, you don't know what you're going to need for the future because you're still doing what you always did. Peter Drucker said, if you want to stop doing something that's obsolete, stop doing it. Do something new. We have resisted that. Everyone says we can't do that. And the military throws up an enormous barrier against us. Oh, if you do that, it's catastrophic, we're finished. It's back to, if you change the battleship, we're finished. We're out. No, we're not. And it can be done.
Since we are a maritime power, I want to use my friend here, Jay Madden. But since we are a maritime power and we've seen the reduction in the size of the Navy, and even the capabilities of the Navy, you have an administration that's very reluctant to use our force, and if you spend any time in Asia, as I do, people are invariably asking the question, where is the American Navy? And there is going to be some sort of Pacific competition between the Chinese and the Americans. It's largely a question of regional hegemony. The Chinese are saying, this is ours, this is ours, the Pacific is ours. It's no longer the American basin. So the question that becomes, do we have the capability within the existing maritime structure to project power in a manner that's consistent with what our interests are?
Well, I think we do. Now, set aside the little crappy ship, the LCS, is what the admirals probably call it, the little crappy ship. We have a big problem in the Navy because the admirals and the Naval Sea Systems Command where I worked has utterly refused to develop new platforms. If you don't develop new platforms, you build more Arleigh Burkes and you build little crappy ships. The little crappy ship was shoved down everybody's throat because we have to keep the shipyards operating. We have 6 shipyards. We can't keep 4 busy, but no one wants to shut down any shipyards. These are problems. You're familiar with this sort of thing on the Hill. But the bottom line is, yes, we do. I mean, there's more military power in one U.S. Navy carrier battle group in the northeastern Pacific than there is all over Asia except for Japan and China. And if you look at China, China wants to restore the Sino-centric sort of cultural economic realm, which is what they had for thousands of years. But all they've done is precipitate enormous forces against them. The Japanese are in the Philippines, the Japanese are in Vietnam, the Japanese are in Taiwan, the Japanese are everywhere in Korea. I don't know if you've been following it, but the Koreans and the Japanese already have secret arrangements to cooperate in the event of any kind of conflict. These things are now coming into the open. The dumber the Chinese behave, the more pushback there is. The notion that we have to lead with the nose is wrong. What we can do, and do very, very easily, is stand behind all of these countries, encourage them to do what they have refused to do for decades and cooperate, and we can sell them lots of capability that they want. We're going to go down to 9 carrier battle groups. Carrier battle group is being selected for eventual extinction, like every platform in history goes through this. 2 of those, I would make a deal with the Japanese tomorrow morning. How would you like to have 2 carrier battle groups in return for which you forgive part of our national debt to you? If you gave the Japanese 2 carrier battle groups, the Chinese would probably come unglued, but it would be a very useful way to put an end to a lot of the stupidity in Beijing. There's another problem in China nobody here understands. China is not so good. Not only is it weak, far, far weaker militarily, but in contrast to the Soviet Union, the party and the Communist Party and the military were inextricably intertwined, very separate in China. And a lot of what's happening is happening over the objections of political leaders in Beijing who do not like this confrontation for the reasons I've outlined. It's bad for business. Who's China's #1 trading partner? Japan and the United States. They're the #1 trading partners. You know, they don't want trouble, but you've got hotheads in the PLA who are trying to assert themselves and appealing to nationalism. There are a lot of problems in China. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I'm saying we have to look at this a little more, with a little more sophistication than we have. And we have to understand that one of the 2 aircraft carriers that the Chinese have has just recently been turned into a hotel. which is probably a good idea, frankly, and that's something we can consider on our own if nobody wants to do that. But the Navy is also doing a lot of other things that are very smart, because privately, you get with Raynard and the four-star admirals, and I worked at that level with these guys, they know what the hell is going on. And what are they looking at? They realize that for the Navy to be effective and relevant in the future, it has to have the capability for long-range strike. And to do that, it's going to have to be unmanned. And that's the U-class. It has lots of ups and downs, but they understand that's where they're headed. They understand that they have to have new systems to allow them to influence what happens ashore. But I think the notion that we're at risk, no. The problem that we have right now is that no one wants to think differently from the way they have thought in the past. Odierno is a good example. I want a new ground combat vehicle. Excuse me, General. And why? Oh, I'm going to put it into the 1942 Triangular Division designed by General Leslie McNair. And it's going to replace the Bradleys that are currently inside, the brigades inside the Triangular Division designed by Leslie McNair. Why would you do that? This is exactly what the French Army did in the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s. They took all of the quote-unquote new technology innovations and shoved them in the old force structure. We know that worked out very well. My point is, this is not the answer. The answer is, you want new platforms. You should rapid prototype in smaller numbers. You should put them inside new organizations, find out what the new capabilities are. This should not be viewed in isolation from what the Air Force and the Navy bring to the fight. In other words, there has to be a holistic approach to force development. We can't afford, nor do we need to bring everything that we brought to war years ago. You know, a lot of people don't realize this, but in Desert Storm, we put 340,000 men on the ground. During the Korean War, when we were fighting the Chinese army, we never had more than 200,000 soldiers on the ground in Korea. What was the difference? And if you look at the forces, the difference was that most of the guys that we put on the ground in Korea in 1940 or in 1950 and 51, 52 infantry carried rifles. And there was a lot of artillery, huge quantities of artillery. And most of the bombs we dropped and missiles we fired didn't hit anything. Today we actually hit targets. Here's a little tidbit that the Army doesn't want anybody to hear. Nobody on the ground wants to admit this, but this is true. In the 40 days of the air campaign in 1991 during Desert Storm, the United States Air Force struck more targets, effectively, more targets in 40 days than the 8th Air Force hit between 1942 and the end of World War II. Now think about that. That's staggering. And the Army and the Marines will tell you, no, that's not important. No, it is very important, because it's a tremendous enabler for you on the ground, but it's also something that you on the ground should be interested in magnifying. You know, we're recently going through the 40-year anniversary of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And if you go back and you look at that war, it's very important. People are not paying enough attention to it for the right reasons. Some of you may have looked at it will remember that the air defense technology that was employed by the Egyptians was very effective against the Israelis. And ultimately, the Israelis were successful. Most of that air defense technology was destroyed by tanks on the ground. And as soon as the Israelis were able to cross the canal, their number one priority was not to go to Cairo and conquer Egypt. It was not to occupy Egypt. It was to destroy the air defenses. Because once the air defenses were destroyed, you had absolute unchallenged air supremacy. And with unchallenged air supremacy, what can you do? You can be completely inept in many respects and very incapable, and there isn't a whole hell of a lot the enemy can do about you. So there's a permanent interest on the ground in achieving that kind of supremacy. It goes back to the earlier point about full spectrum dominance. We don't need it everywhere. We don't have to have everybody everywhere. But if we decide that we're going to go somewhere, if it's the Korean Peninsula, if it's Vietnam, God forbid that we should be dumb enough to involve ourselves in a war with China. But if we go to someplace to do something, that's where you want your full spectrum dominance. And we can do that. We have the satellites, we have the aerostats, we have the aircraft, we have the platforms at sea, undersea. We have the sensors, seabed to space. We can do that. And that's when you bring your forces into that environment. And that environment is the one that you fight in. But you don't have to have those everywhere. You don't have to bankrupt yourself building that everywhere. And that's what people need to understand, because Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin have a permanent interest in bankrupting you and stealing all of your taxpayer money in order to build that full spectrum dominance everywhere. And the service chiefs will all say, yes, we want that everywhere. We can't afford it, and we don't need it. But we do want it where we need it, when we need it. I should shut up.
Ted, I want to get your response. I mean, that was great.
That was great, and I agree with some of what Doug said. And I want to start basically where he began as well. I mean, at the beginning of the 20th century, the crowning of George V, there was no great threat that was an existential threat towards Great Britain. It had lost not much of its empire. It had really dominated the seas. And it faced very little. If you saw the parade of kings at that coronation, the German king was there, the Hungarian king was there, the Prussian king was there, yada, yada, yada. They were all there in a great show of unity, in a great show of friendship. And it all meant nothing because in 14 years at that point, a couple years less than that, the entire of Europe exploded in a war that took millions upon millions of lives and frankly wasted them in a manner of warfare that had been outdated long before the war broke out. And you have a situation, well, a couple of things come to mind with that. One of the things we had, then they had, was the fact that war had progressed to the point where it could be mechanized to a degree, but the massed formations of armies were unable to deploy any technology that allowed them to break through. And as a result, the millions of casualties, the hundreds of thousands of Tommies, I mean, what was it, at the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 75,000 Frenchmen were killed. You know, that is an industrialized killing. It is not warfare because technology has been neglected. And now I go to the point.
Except that, if I can being here, this is important for everyone to understand. That was by design on the ground. That wasn't because there weren't alternatives, that things couldn't be done differently.
Well, with all respect, though,
The Navies, if you look at the Navies, you know, if you look at the Navies, and you look at the standard technology in the Navies in 1900, then you look at the armies, it's astonishing, the difference.
But the point was they chose to fight a ground war because the Germans made it a ground war by going through Belgium.
Yeah, but there's something else too that's very important here. And we should list this. Britain didn't have to fight that war. Britain chose to enter it against a country that was never the enemy, on the grounds that it should help its former adversary, France. Well, you stop and think about it. This is very important because that's my big nightmare with the United States, that we involve ourselves in a regional war that we think will work quickly.
But the point I'm making here is that technology was not able to catch up with the general's desire to grind men into dust. What we have at this case in 2013 in the United States of America, we have existential threats, not like Britain at the turn of 1914, 1912, 1914. We have existential threats that will come to us through terrorism, which may be mounted in all sorts of manners. We may be having an existential threat through our allies, through Iran. We have different existential threats from, well...
Wait a minute, Joe, I'm sorry, but I just can't...
I just deserve a little bit, I need to let...
Yeah, okay, but I want to be able to respond. This is scary stuff.
Well, the point of the matter is the world's a scary place.
Not at all. It's very specific.
Oh, yeah, no, finish your thought.
My thought is that we don't have a national strategy which can fund any sort of Pentagon whatsoever. So, again, with all due respect to Doug, it is a big mistake for us to be talking about how we're going to say, well, to the Navy, because they have more admirals than they have ships, that you've got to do away with a little crappy ship, and you've got to get more ships of different types. What we need to be doing is, we need to think about what we are going to do in the world. The existential threats are there. Again, Doug, without, with due respect to you, there are existential threats out there. We have to be able to deal with them. And if we don't have a national strategy with which we are going to deal with them, there's no use in trying to do anything else. Before we do that, we have to make sure we have some sort of strategy. And when I say a strategy, are we going to accept a nuclear Iran? Well, maybe we will. Maybe that's a bad decision. Maybe that's a good decision. At this point, we haven't decided. We are going to accept Japanese defense of their own homelands and let them go alone. Maybe that's what we're going to do. Joe Biden is over there in China and Japan trying to talk them into some sort of a compromise. they're not going to go for that. You know, there may be 7 crappy little islands called the Senkakus out there, which might end up being a military incident, not a war, but there are things we have to deal with. The question is, what do we want to do? What reach does America have to have in order to maintain the place that we want it to have in the world? Are we going to be a superpower again? We are not now. I don't mind that we are withdrawing from certain areas. For the Middle East to dominate us for a dozen years or more, as it has, is probably a big mistake because there's a lot of other things going on in the world. We have tried a strategy called nation building, which is one of the cataclysmic failures. It's the biggest mistake we've made since 9/11. And the fact of the matter is we're still trying to do it. And our nation is choosing to have its militaries function in a manner that is keyed to nation building. So that is the wrong strategy. We know that, and it's driving, as any strategy will, the structure of the military. Now, where do we go from there? We need to figure out what do we want to do. That old great line from Sean Connery in The Untouchables. What are you prepared to do? What do we want to be prepared to do? What we want to be prepared to do, I believe, is to have our allies rely on us to a degree, not in an open-ended way. Maybe some are going to qualify for an open-ended commitment. There are some that will. I would say Israel is probably one. I would say Japan is probably another. The point of the matter is, America needs to have a reach and the ability to project power. How are you going to do that? Before we get to the idea of shaking up the Pentagon, I know the Pentagon needs to be shaken up, but what are we going to do? We're making bad decisions in the meantime here. We're talking about what are we going to do to the United States of America's Air Force. Are we going to have the F-35, which is unsustainable, too expensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We talk about, well, full spectrum air supremacy. How are you going to do that? When do you want to be able to do that? The point of the matter is, for the military, in the function of our civilian-driven government, the civilians rule over the military under the Constitution. That's the proper thing to do. We don't want to have the Praetorian Guard. We don't want to have the military telling the civilians what they should do and what they should believe. What we have to have is a situation where, for example, a chief of staff, a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is going to be called in to a crisis with the president, and he's going to sit down there in the crisis room in the White House, the situation, whatever you want to call it, and say, well, boss, here's what we can do. We have these 2 or 3 options. But the fewer options you have, the less choices a president has to deal with them. The American military has its job as to be able to provide as many good options as possible. Right now, we have a situation where our military is structured to fight counterinsurgency warfare. We've been doing that for 12 years. It's not the right thing to be able to do. What do we want to be able to do? Do we want to tell the Japanese that we're going to give them 2 carrier groups? Nonsense. We're not going to give them 2 carrier groups because we may need them elsewhere. The fact of the matter is we have a fleet which is very big and very capable, but what are you going to have in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years? That fleet is going to be different. It's going to have different size. It's going to have different manning. And we talk about, in Doug's article, talks about, well, we're going to restructure the command structure here, and we're going to save $100 or $150 billion by doing that. Well, that money's already gone. The money has been gone. It's gone to sequestration. It's gone to other cuts. These things are not going to be giving us another peace dividend. We have to have a way to make our forces more effective and to develop the technologies that make them more effective. Right now, we are strangling the development of technology. The development of technology comes from more technology development. When we cut off, for example, the production of the F-22, we cut off an awful lot of the research that was being done to further fast, stealthy aircraft. We made a big mistake by going into the F-35, which we're compromising all of these things. Instead of pushing the envelope of technology, we're just saying, okay, this is where we're going to cut it off. And this is good enough. It's not good enough. If you want to have a place, any place in the world, if you want to say we can have full spectrum superiority anywhere in the world on day X, well, you're going to have to invest and you're going to have to make a lot smarter decisions in order to do that. The way you're going to be able to do that is to push technology. We're probably going to be able, I think significantly, able to cut the size of the ground forces. That's simply what we're going to be doing, whether we like it or not. How are we going to do that to make those ground forces more effective? To the extent Doug is right, there's going to be some necessary reformation, if you want, of the military's command structure to make it a more lethal force. And that's what this is all about. The size, yes, that's important. The command structure, yes, that's important, but the real question is killing people and breaking things. How much do you want to be able to do that in foreign places at the right time? If you have that decision, if you decide how much of that you want to be able to do in any given place, at any given time, then you have to find a strategy, kind of back backwards, but it's one way to get there. You have to be able to decide what America's role in the world is, and that's my principal point, because none of the rest of this stuff matters unless we decide those things first. We are no longer a superpower because the President of the United States has decided we should no longer be a superpower. And we need to have the things that we need to restore some level of superpower role, some level, so that other countries can rely on us. The Israelis have basically said, forget it. The Saudis are saying, forget it. The Japanese are saying, holy crap, we need to do this ourselves. And this is a kind of breakdown. It's not an empire. Doug is right on that. We don't want an empire. We're a maritime power. We're an aerospace and air and sea power, and we can project force that way. But we have to decide what is our strategy to do that. Where do you want to be able to intervene? Where do you want to have people who can rely on you? And that's the real thing. Is America going to be a reliable force in the world for its own protection, as well as the protection for our allies? And at that point, I'll turn it back.
Well,
You have a question?
No, I know we're running out of time.
Yeah.
You asked me where we're going, how we're gonna do it, and to me, it's catch-22. I mean, I'm only a buck sergeant from the Vietnam era, so I wasn't at the high levels, deciding how that war was gonna go. But I think the answer to both of your input is that we have to be economic power first.
Absolutely.
And we're losing our economic power.
Absolutely.
So if we don't have the economic power, then we cannot have the military power because we don't have the resources to provide the military. And we are already under the gun by having ourselves up the butt and debt with China. I mean, they basically own us. And at the same time, we have to remember the strategy that Ronald Reagan took. We outspent the Soviets, and that's where we got apart. So we got to have that, the ability to retain or regain our economic power, so we can again be a military power. So you have those two things have to come into conjunction. The reason why we're cutting is because we're down to economic power. We don't have the resources and the money to pour into the military. The second thing is that I'm just an observer here, but the old military structure, like you guys say, it's changed. It's no longer just the ground troops, because I remember during Vietnam, and it was a disaster the way that thing was managed. Is now we have cyber threats, and we have terrorist threats. It's the military's job is, like you said, to go in and blow up and kill. It's not the nation building. That's another thing that we have to look at, is that that's not our role in the military. That's leave that up to the UN or somebody else that's inefficient at it as well. But the thing is that it's a different type of military now. You've got to have more, ability to use technology, just like you said that during the past wars, technology wasn't utilized right, so that's why we got all that, the blood in the battlefields. And we have those abilities of technologies now. So your soldier now is not just a guy carrying a rifle, and the guy's carrying, he's carrying a cell phone or some kind of a pad that basically, when he needs information where he can execute. So my whole thing is the fact that we need to be an economic power again before we can maintain our power militarily. Because if we can do that, then the other countries who are thinking something stupid, then I got to do it because they know that we can outspend them and we can hammer them.
No, you're absolutely right. I wrote about 18 months ago in the American Spectator, an article called The Conservative Defense Agenda. And the first thing I said in that is that America's economy has been the engine of freedom around the world for over 100 years now. Yes. And the point of the matter is, we have let ourselves slip. I mean, under Obama's economic policies, we have slipped so far now.
Well, there are two issues that have been raised, one by Doug and one by Jed. I would just like to at least make a very brief statement about it. The first is this whole question of innovation, which I believe is absolutely essential. I mean, when we start thinking about the military, some form of a Frenchman, we can't think the way we did in the past. Obviously, innovation is necessary. But what I also find rather interesting, the private sector is engaged in innovation all the time. even if you look at World War II and what happened in the period, the Lend-Lease period, it was largely private innovation that accounted for the extraordinary success of the United States in building an industrial machine that accounted for our success in the war. It wasn't success, it was excess. It was the ability to create a great deal. And it seems to me that we ought to be thinking very seriously about the role that the private sector can play in the defense establishment. That's point number one. And then I think that raises a very interesting point about what is happening in the Pacific. There's no question that the United States is not playing the same role that it once did. The Japanese obviously are very much concerned about playing a far more robust military role than it has in the past. It's virtually doubled its defense budget in the last year and a half. So there's no question the Japanese understand what has to be done. And Doug, I think quite rightly, talks about an alliance that may include the South Koreans, Taiwanese, Filipinos, maybe the Indians as well, since they have engaged in joint military maneuvers with the Japanese. So there is a force that's emerging, let's call it SEATO 2, although SEATO wasn't exactly successful, but something on that order, where the nations come together. But the issue, every time I've raised this issue, and I've sat down with some circles in Asia where this subject comes up, the distrust of the Japanese, a kind of legacy of World War II, haunts the discussions. The South Koreans hate the Japanese. When I talk about the enemy, they don't refer to the Chinese. They always say the Japanese. When I say the Indonesians, the enemy, they say, oh, the Japanese. So the difficulty here is that the United States has to play a subtle but interesting diplomatic role in bringing these nations together so that they can play a role that the United States might once have played in the past.
And one thing I add to that is, and I think that's absolutely right, but unless we have the will to project power in those areas, and I'm talking about military power, not soft power.
Right.
I'm talking about our ability to project power in those areas. Those nations have no reason to follow our lead. They have no reason to even listen to us. So again, with regard
The less we do, the more they will do.
maybe,
Oh, yes, yeah. The Yoshida Doctrine has been a blessing to Japan. Thanks to our defense of Japan and its interests, they have built a fabulous site, an industrial base, prosperity on a scale they never had before. So have the South Koreans. By the way, all of the major corporations, innovation and technology, everything in South Korea came out. All of this business of hating Japanese, when she starts talking with the elites, bullshit. That's not it. In fact, the people running South Korea are the grandchildren and children of all the collaborators of the Japanese, because the Japanese went into Korea and they industrialized the place. There's nothing there before the Japanese went in.
It's the same with Taiwan and China.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, with Taiwan, as soon as you bring that up, if you want a war between Japan and China, the quickest way to get it is for Taiwan to ally itself with Japan, because Taiwan is the platform for the projection of Japanese military power against China. Everything the Chinese are doing right now has nothing to do with us. It has to do with the Sino-Japanese War of 1937. You have to look at how the Japanese went into China, how they used the rivers, how they went into all the big cities on the coast and controlled the place. China will not allow that to happen again. It's not focused on us, and we don't have to break our way into China. The problem is we could be drawn in Northeast Asia, if we're not smart, into a war we don't need to fight against people who aren't the enemies. And that's my nightmare from World War II. This business of, well, we have to be strong, but we don't have to be in charge of everything everywhere all the time. That's a mistake. And we should be in a position to pick and choose when we will engage and when we will not engage. We got to change our mindset. Jeb's right, strategy. There is no real strategy. We haven't had really one since 1989. Nobody wants it. And if we try to put one together formally, you'd have huge fights with people saying, we are America's engine of freedom. Bullshit, we are not. Washington said it best. He said, America's mission in the world is to be its engine of prosperity. It's our economic power that makes us attractive. That's how we spread the democracy. They look at us and say, look what a success we are as an economy. But we destroyed ourselves in the 1980s when we shipped our manufacturing base overseas. There's no innovation without a manufacturing base. Now, you mentioned the French Army. The French Army spent more money than the German Army before 1940. Very few people know that. Didn't help. Money in doesn't equal product out. Just because you throw money at something doesn't mean that you're creating capability. This is a huge problem. And we've been doing this for decades. It needs to stop. You're talking about a defense department that can't even audit itself. No one has been able to go in and audit it. They will freely admit they don't know where all the money is going. That's no way to run a railroad. if you reduce funding for it and you go in with a plan and you begin to perform selective surgery and reorganization and reform, what you would do in the private sector, you can extract savings and you will have a better, more potent force than you have today. This thing is a whale beached. It is not a potent force. It is a World War II force structure that is slowly, gradually brought together and then hurled somewhere. It won't work. If you go to war with China, there is no time for a pickup game. You can't go to 50 different headquarters in the Pacific that are Air Force and Navy and Army and say, okay guys, we're going to war now, get together. The reason the Soviet Union defeated Germany on the Eastern Front, the principal reason is that they had unity of command. They built integrated command structures from top to bottom. The Germans never did it because Adolf liked to tinker with everything. And the services themselves said, oh, this is great because we in the Luftwaffe get to do what we want. We in the Army get to do what we want. It's a disaster. We're wasting huge quantities of money. The Marines have a communications structure inside the Marine Corps that doesn't talk to the Navy. It doesn't talk to the Army. This is insane. How the hell did this happen? Well, it happened because the N6 in the Navy, who's a 3-star, was ignored by the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He doesn't give a shit what he says. There's no unity of command. No one is in charge. And so when they come to the Hill, they go to Duncan Hunter, and they say, you know, Congressman Hunter, we really need this, and you're a former Marine, we need your help. I'll help you guys. And off to the races we go. They used to do that all the time, all over the Hill. Everybody does. We understand. That game is unaffordable. It's unsustainable. And in the meantime, we are shedding the people who actually deploy and fight, the people who can do something. The production lines in the military are dwindling. The overhead is enormous. If you say, that's fine, just give it more money, we're dead. In 10 years, we're dead. I don't want to go to war with China. I don't want to go to war with anybody if we can avoid it. And I'm somebody who's been to war, being shot at and killed people. But we'll probably be in a position in 10 years where something bad can happen. Now, you mentioned Iran. Iran is a pimple on a duck's ass militarily and economically. Their principal exports after oil and gas, and they can't even refine their own oil, are pistachio nuts and rugs. They're a zero. They're in deep shit. Their population hates the government. They're finished. It's over. The country in the region is dangerous and has enormous potential and has a martial tradition, which Iran doesn't, is Turkey. There are 78 million of them. They are Sunnis, and they are being gradually molded into a group of fanatical Ottoman wannabes. And in 10 years, that's your regional superpower, if not sooner. That's going to be a problem. The Europeans know it, the Germans know it, the Austrians know it, the Swedes know it, the people in the Balkans know it, the Russians know it, and they're very afraid of it. That's what we should be thinking about, not worrying about Iran. Nobody's got to close the Strait of Hormuz. If you close the Strait of Hormuz, there's no money in 30 days, there's no money for food. In 60 days, everybody starves. We got to be realistic about this. And Turkey can get a nuclear weapon, doesn't have to develop anything, tomorrow morning from its closest partner. You know who that is? Pakistan.
And they probably can get it from Russia too, but
No.
well, whatever. The point really comes down to you can't ignore the effects of an Iranian nuclear weapon. That is going to change. That's going to be a game changer throughout the Middle East. It will dominate that region, and we can't afford for them to happen.
Well, I disagree.
What do you think about the recent agreement?
It's a disaster. It gives away. Well, it's very simple. We're, number one, giving them another 6 months in which to develop a bomb, which they are doing. We know that. We know they've been developing nuclear triggers. We know they've been testing missiles versus warheads and the ability of making the missiles with a warhead. You know, these are not things that peaceful people do. And we're telling them, well, you have 50% of your uranium that's enriched to 20%. You can keep that, do whatever you want with that. We're just going to say the other half you're supposed to build down to 5%, the so-called civilian level. The point of the matter is they still have their centrifuges running. They have their hidden and hardened systems. These are not peaceful intentions. And those people will develop a bomb, and what's going to happen when they announce that they've got it? Well, maybe they'll use it, maybe they won't. But the point of the matter comes down to we can't afford every American president.
So you gotta stop them.
Believe they're telling the truth.
Well,
You're going to tell them they believe they're telling the truth.
Yeah, when they say they're going to use it.
Well, okay.
How are you gonna
But the
stop
point,
them?
how are you going to stop them?
Who said they're going to use a nuclear weapon? Who said that?
They have said many
Who
times,
is that?
the Khamenei himself.
Khamenei is against God's law to have nuclear weapons.
That's false. That is absolutely false. There was a Fox story that showed that the supposed fatwa that had Khamenei declaring that the nuclear weapon was against the will of God, that was a phony, and it's all there on the record. The point of the matter is they have a belief that this will change their place in the world, and it will. And if we are going to stop them, I don't see how we can do so peacefully. I pray that we can, but there's got to be a way to keep the sanctions going. If you want a peaceful solution, you keep the sanctions going, you increase them if you can, and you insist that there is no settlement that does not include unlimited inspections of their facilities.
If I could add a couple things to the debate real quick. We reinforced the idea that they should have nuclear weapons by the fact that every other country who's given them up, we've taken adverse action against. Libya being the problem.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
we reinforced.
it's a disaster.
So that's why I think they've been on this. Secondly, my information is they've already got 2 weapons. And Reza Khalili has confirmed this from his sources, and they were given to them by the North Koreans. North Koreans have shared this with them, so I think it's a matter of time. And some of you know, I worked with Jim Woolsey on this issue back in the 90s, and we knew 5 years before we admitted we knew about the North Koreans having weapons. Second, I just want to throw that out there for the next debate, because we're almost out of time. Secondly, I think there's an issue we haven't really addressed, which I think we should, is India. India now sees itself as a competitor of China more than Pakistan. Pakistan is now an adolescent. It's an annoyance to them. So I think that's something else regarding the population and economic development of that region. And now the Indian Navy is actually developing itself to be more effective. And they are actually engaged in this new internal defense building. And they don't trust the West because they've had bad experience with this. They don't necessarily trust the Russians. But so they're now actually engaging in their own development of capacity. So I think it's something else we should study in the long run. And lastly,
The Indians are also having huge economic problems, large unemployment.
but they have a plan to move forward, and they're in a much better developments than Pakistan. Pakistan's line is flat. And then the last thing I was going to bring up, and we've talked about this, we're developing something called Plan Orange versus Squeezing the Orange at the Army War College, which will be in late January. So that would be,
Asian
we will be looking at, we will be examining as a group, I think everybody here is going to be involved in some form in that, looking at the strategy, which you bring up, Jed, I completely agree with you, as well as the resource issue, which I think obviously a lot of people in the Army agree with you, the way that your perspective is about the fact that we don't want to cut, or say we can cut, because the moment we say we can cut, they're going to cut us. So it's chicken or the egg. So I
Just one point that I would like to make about Turkey, and I just bring this to a conclusion. The Turkish government has done very, very well as an economy from 2002 to 2008. They're so overburdened with debt at the moment that if the Saudis don't bail them out, this whole society collapses. They are a great military force in the area, since they're the second largest army and air force in NATO. But they're
Who's the largest army?
second largest.
Who's bigger than that?
The Germans have a larger force.
The German army's 8,000 men.
Well, that's what I was told. Well, maybe they're the largest.
No, they're the biggest army.
In any case, look, there's no question about the military capability they have, but the country is very close to bankruptcy. And the debt burden is so great that you can only borrow up to 32%, which is the interest rate. You can't borrow any more than that. Erdogan will probably go, even though he's attempted to purge the military. I think there will be a coup in the country. So again,
If that happens, that's good.
I think it would be very good. I do think it will happen.
Who with the seculars?
Yeah,
Yes, as you know, when you talk about the Islamization of Turkey, the Turks by and large have imbibed the Ataturk tradition. They're secular people. The Pew polls show time and again that the Turks overwhelmingly oppose the idea of Islamization. There is a portion of the country on the order of 25% that embrace this. So the country by and large is a secular nation. So I guess we can end on that point.
I sincerely hope so. But you see, I would say one thing. Iranian population is interested in Israel, it just doesn't do that. All they're interested in is prosperity. They want to break out of this terrible straitjacket they're in with the government. They openly refer to the government as quote unquote the Arabs, because they see them literally as a foreign entity not representative of Persian culture.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think you probably have the most pro-American force in the Middle East and Iran. But that's not the government, that's not the U.S.
No, of course not.
So that's the problem.
But the notion that these people are somehow or another dangerous maniacs who are going to lob nukes at people, whether it's Israel or anybody else, I think is very wrong, absolutely wrong. And they know it would be suicidal. And remember that Iran is largely a desert and mountain country. All the people are concentrated in most of the major cities. They recognize what would happen to them, they'd be incinerated. I think the problem that we have inside Iran with the quote-unquote bomb issue is that you have Iranian nationalism that for 40, 50 years has wanted some sort of nuclear weapon. Not to destroy anybody, but to join in their minds what they think is the great power club. Iran is one of these countries that's always thought more of itself than it could achieve. The Shah actually came to Nixon and wanted Nixon to provide him with nuclear weapons. And Nixon said, for what? You don't need them. He said, no, we're not a great power until we have them. So that's part of it. But I think that the religiosity and these kinds of things, those mosques are increasingly empty. No one is showing up. The whole internal apparatus, the Iranian security apparatus and the military, is absolutely mired in all the corruption that comes with capitalism and commercialism. They're busy worrying about factories and making money and so forth. This thing, if we are smart, and we proceed very carefully and cautiously, I'm not saying that we should, throw up our hands and say, hallelujah, it's over, but it will go away, because it's not in the nature of that country to do the things that we are appealing to.
Let me just say that I strongly disagree, because Iran, even though the people are unhappy with the government, and there are many millions of them that are, the fact is they do not have any power. Iran is basically a garrison state. It's a military regime, and a lot of people completely overlook that. The IRGC, the Ayatollahs, and their political apparatus, they rule that country with an iron hand, and the people are not going to be able to change that for 20 years or more. The fact is, if we have the leverage of the sanctions that will keep the economy on its ass and flat on its back, we may have the leverage that could topple the Ayatollahs eventually. However, given their involvement with terrorism, given their connections to pretty much every terrorist group, and their apoplectically apocalyptic regime view of the world, we cannot let them have a nuclear weapon, and that's exactly what we're doing with this agreement.
Can I
I
add
see.
one more thing, please? If you say economic power, military power, informational power, because, we gotta have that. And secondly, you mentioned Latin America is not a big issue. Coming from Nicaragua, where Somoza was there for 40 years, having a dictator and a communist government. The Chinese are all over Latin America. The Iranians are building, facilities in Bolivia, taking the uranium out for capability. Latin America, maybe it's not a threat in the military sense, but it's a threat in the economic sense, because if you have the poverty and the destabilization, we're going to have a huge influx, not illegal immigrants, but the economic immigrants coming to the United States, refugees.
Listen, I agree with you. I just don't see much value in attacking those countries.
No,
I was one of
attacking.
the people back in the 80s who opposed any intervention.
But all those guys are down there, and they're pouring money into those countries, particularly the Alpha countries.
I think this has been a fantastic discussion, but in lieu of the time, I think that we should meet in the near future to discuss Iran and Latin America.
We're gonna have every opportunity to do that, make sure that we have a replay of this in
Exactly.
New York. And Doug, thank you so much.
Very good.
Thank you for joining us.